Welcome to Grit with Wisdom. This is the podcast that delves deep into the inner psyche of mountain bikers from all aspects of our sport in order to discover the tools and the tactics that can help us have more fun out on the trails more often. Our aim here is to help you understand what it takes to push our own personal boundaries in the sport we love from a mental and emotional perspective. Hello, and welcome back to the Grit with Wisdom podcast. I'm super stoked today to be sitting down with my buddy, Matthew Smith. We've just been out for an awesome mountain bike ride. We went and rode Hawaii here in Squamish, checking out some classic Squamish slabs that are super grippy as always. So that was super fun. And I'm very excited today to dig into today's episode because Matt is a guy that wears many hats. He's not only a critical care flight paramedic and a paramedic trainer, but he also runs his own business, which is called Canadian Outdoor Medical Consulting. And they specialize in running a whole bunch of different wilderness first aid clinics and also specialize in risk management. So he's got a really diverse experience there. And as if that doesn't keep him busy enough already, he also works part-time for Whistler Bike Park as a bike patroller and then as a ski patroller in the winter. And I believe you also do some backcountry guiding as well. So lots of different hats there. Obviously, the common theme here is risk management and also high intensity situations that can potentially lead to some high stress. So I'm super excited to dive into the mindset behind that and talk about how Matt uses some of his hobbies, including mountain biking, to keep himself grounded in his personal life outside of all this crazy work. So with no further ado, welcome to the Grit with Wisdom podcast, Matt. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me here. It's an honor to be on a podcast. I've been watching your podcast for the last little bit, and you've had some really awesome guests. So I feel very humbled to be on the podcast.
So cool to hear, man. I'm super stoked to get your perspective here today. How was that intro? Did I miss any gaps there?
No, that was great, man. Yeah, I sometimes wear too many hats, but trying to do the best I can with what I have.
You do a fantastic job, my friend. Well, let's get into it. I wanted to start with, what is your why when it comes to riding mountain bikes?
It's a great question. It's probably changed over the years. I first got into riding very late 90s, early 2000s, and I got into it because I really enjoyed the challenge. And I think at that point in my life, I was looking for the suffering. I started to ride in the early days of cross-country racing. So I really enjoyed that, like getting out, grinding. As a somewhat lost, angst-ridden teenager, I found a lot of solace in long, grueling rides and cross-country races. So I think that's what first drew me to it. But what I very quickly discovered was the community. And I think community and the friends that I've made in the mountain bike world are still some of my best friends. Between mountain biking and skiing, those are my best friends, the people that I made working in the bike world, working as a ski patroller 20-something years ago. Those are my best friends today. So it started out as just wanting to challenge myself, and it's morphed into, there's still a component of that, but what really brings me back is community, being around people and moving through nature. I grew up outside, grew up in rural Ontario and with a father that took me outside. So it's that combination of being outside, challenging myself, but more and more being part of a community of amazing people.
Yeah, man, that's fantastic to hear. And I think, it's something a lot of listeners and myself included have in common, kind of going through those teenage years. We've got lots of energy, lots of emotions we don't know what to do with. It can be such a great way just to get outside and vent. And experience all the positive benefits of being outside in nature. And I'm curious, kind of growing up there out in Ontario, when did you find it kind of first get the thought or first get the idea of moving out here west to BC?
Oh, I think it was watching ski and bike movies that really, I started working at a ski shop when I was 15 and growing up in Ottawa. And I started watching ski and bike movies. And I remember watching a TGR movie and I thinking, this is what I want to do with my life. So finished high school, skipped graduation, jumped in an old car with my buddy, and we drove out here for the first time, rode Whistler Mountain Bike Park. And that's when I decided that, I wanted to spend my life in the mountains.
What was it like your first time at Whistler Mountain Bike Park? What can you remember from that day?
We had no money, super sketchy. I actually camped in a tent on a buddy's roof.
Oh, wow.
I don't remember a lot about the bike park. I was riding a Gary Fisher hardtail at the time. So I remember it being super janky.
Wow.
But I also got out and did some pedaling. We rode Comfortably Numb, which was one of the epic trails. And I remember that being I've ridden it since, and it wasn't nearly as epic, but I guess that's my biggest memory of my first time I was riding comfortably numb, and just what an epic trail it was.
And that's fantastic. Coming out here, getting it done on a hardtail. Were the locals riding hardtails as well then, or were there downhill bikes around?
Yeah, that would have been early 2000s. So that's where I first saw downhill bikes. And then downhill bikes very quickly made their way back to Quebec, and I spent a ton of time riding in Quebec, where there's so many good racers come out of Quebec as well. But yeah, there was definitely downhill bikes. But we had no money, so I'd worked in a bike shop, saved up enough to buy my old hardtail, and that's what I rode for a lot of years.
Man, that's fantastic. The rest is history, hey? And I'm sure there's so many people working in bike shops throughout the Sea to Sky, throughout BC that can really relate. No money,
That's
but
right.
all the time in the world to have fun and enjoy the epic
That's
trails
right.
around here. That's fantastic. So I want to dive right in here. I mentioned a bunch of different roles, a bunch of different things you do for work, and spend your time as. Let's dive into some of those. Let's talk about what you do for work.
Yeah, so full time, I work for BCHS as a critical care paramedic with the infant transport team. So I've sort of specialized in pediatric and neonatal critical care. Worked throughout COVID. During COVID, I found it really hard, like a lot of healthcare providers did, a lot of challenges. So the last few years, I've been lucky enough to have an opportunity to move into education. So fly a desk, as they say. So I've spent more time focusing on my role as a paramedic educator, working and teaching advanced care paramedics.
Mm.
Still work a little bit on the front line, but tons of respect for people who can stay in that career for a long, long time. And there's people at my station who've been doing the job longer than I've been alive, and they're still on the front line. They still love it. A lot of respect for people that can find the mental stamina to stay in that job for that long. I really enjoy it, but I'm appreciative now that I can full-time be in education and work that job part-time, because it is very challenging. It's taxing.
Totally. Yeah, I bet there's just more mental strain than I can even start to imagine in a role like that. But I do think it's fantastic that you have found this path now because you are a great teacher and you're now, yeah, teaching what you've learned in that high stress, high stakes environment to other people to potentially impact a lot of lives in a positive way. So, Matt, we mentioned at the start there, along with the paramedic work, you're, staffing a whole bunch of medical tents at races, at big mountain biking events, things like this. I know one of the things that kind of amazed me in the past was when we chatted about your time working there at Joyride.
Mm.
And how you kind of manage the mental side of watching these guys huck many, many feet up into the air, do all sorts of crazy tricks, potentially hit the ground, and you're the one there that has to pick up the pieces. What was that like?
It was a lot of fun. I mean, I was working for Whistler Blackcomb as just a patroller in the bike park at that spot, but I was finish line medical. It was actually great. There was a really, really great team. Whistler Blackcomb, the bike park especially, has some absolutely fantastic patrollers that operate at a very, very high level. So it was a lot of fun. I was just a member of that team. Again, some really great folks. But it was super stressful being at the finish line, understanding that last feature, if anyone watched Joyride last year, was pretty gnarly. And in practice, we'd watched certain athletes pull and huck the whole thing with pretty significant risk and some pretty significant crashes. Again, those athletes are amazing. They know how to fall. The features are very safely designed, but we do a lot of talking about perceived risk and actual risk. And those athletes are so far in the level of actual risk, despite all their skills, that it was definitely nerve wracking. Getting ready to deal with a worst case scenario. And being prepared to potentially operate in a very large stage in front of a lot of people and to really make sure we can provide the best care possible. Again, great team, great equipment. Felt very prepared for that, but it was definitely a different experience. I watched Joyride for a lot of years, but it was a different experience watching it as a spectator and now being the person who'd have to respond.
Totally, man. And it's just bonkers to me. Like, how do you prepare for that? What are you doing, in the time before it, the morning before it, when you're like, right, it's action time. We've got to be ready to save the day if someone needs us.
It's a good question. And it's still a work in progress for me. There's a lot of things that working with folks on Ski Patrol, especially, I'm again amazed at the level of talent that so many folks have. Some people don't seem to struggle with that sort of mental prep side from a first response perspective. I've always struggled with it. I've been doing this for over 20 years and it's something I still struggle with. So I don't honestly know the best answer. I think for me, there's a part of it of feeling prepared, making sure that I understand the scope I'm working in, making sure that I've checked off my equipment at the start of the day, that I really know where everything is. I'm a very systems-oriented person, so I want to make sure that everything's there, that I know how to operate the vac mat, know how to operate all the pieces. I struggle with technology. I don't like technology, prefer to be outside. So I want to make sure that if there's any sort of gadgets or gizmos or gadgets that I have to use in my profession, that I've double check that I know how to operate those. So a lot of pre-checks, I think, as the day starts to make sure that I'm set up for success.
Totally, man. Yeah, I love that attitude. And we kind of talked about it on our ride earlier, didn't we? This idea of being task orientated and using that as a strength, knowing that you've got all the box ticked, you're focusing on what you need to do rather than focusing on the outcome. So it sounds like to me, instead of spending your time kind of worrying and thinking about the worst case scenario, what happens if someone hucks that last feature and it doesn't go right? You're focusing about, okay, like what do I need to do to keep people safe? I love that. That's fantastic. And you mentioned earlier this idea of perceived risk versus actual risk. Could you explain that for our listeners that haven't heard this concept before?
Yeah, I'm sure there's other folks much more qualified than I to talk about it, but I really like the idea of two concentric circles where, for example, watching my daughter learn how to walk. Often what we perceive as risky often is not risky. So at first it's watching her learn to walk. She's scared to stand up because it's a perceived risk. And then you discover that actually it's not risky to stand up, but then you can walk, and then you can walk on the edge of a sidewalk, for example, and it's not actually risky. So as we grow in our skill sets, then we get on mountain bikes. Mountain bikes are always risky. There's always a level of risk when we're on a mountain bike. But there's that idea of perceived risk, what we perceive as risky. And a lot of people move through their lives, and every time they perceive as something risky, they stop doing it. And I think as humans to grow, we need to push that. It's part of our DNA to need to push that. And it's easy to push that into the realm of actual risk, whereas when something goes wrong, you're actually going to get significantly injured. What we're seeing with so many athletes, whether it's an event like joyride or rock climbing or skiing, is athletes have such a high skill set. They're operating so far in the realm of actual risk that what they perceive as risky is where they perceive that intersection of perceived risk and actual risk. They're so far in the realm of actual risk that the slightest mistake can be significant. We're seeing that in Instagram with athletes riding these insane lines where the consequence isn't just a fall and getting hurt. The consequence is death. So we're seeing that with the quality of bikes we have and with the skill set of the athletes, where perceived risk is being shrunken way into the realm of actual risk.
Yeah, and it's amazing. I'm sure a lot of mountain bikers listening can relate to that. As we progress through our mountain biking journey, it's almost like we put on all these different sets of lenses. And, we might look at something one day and it might be like, well, no way, there's no way I'll ever ride that. We might go back there in a few months or a few years' time and we're like, oh, that looks okay, I can ride that. But it does sometimes get to a point where what looks okay to us and what looks chill is actually still quite risky. The consequences of something going wrong on that line may be really high.
Absolutely.
And it can be easy to ignore that. I think you've used the term like risk creep when we were chatting before.
Yeah, and that's just the concept of you do something that's risky over and over again without negative sequelae, so you're comfortable doing that. And I think I'm not saying we shouldn't take risk, and I think we should, and I enjoy pushing my riding. Today we went out and rode Hueso. That's been a project for me, so it was fun to clean that up and ride all the segments of Hueso. And for some people, Hueso is a trail they'd maybe never ride, and for a lot of people, Hueso is probably a trail they'd ride in their sleep. So we all have our own boundaries, that intersection of perceived risk and actual risk. And we need to be aware, I think, of where we're operating and being aware of risk creep. And the classic example is the winter, where you go and ski a line 15 times and nothing bad happens. That 16th time you ski it, if the conditions have changed, you might end up in a fatal avalanche. So just being aware that because you've done something a bunch of times doesn't necessarily mean that the risk has changed. And I think that's why it's important we use our situational awareness to check in with ourselves, whether it's a first responder going to work or an athlete moving through terrain, an athlete on race day. And I'm sure athletes have their own mental prep to be aware of that risk creep.
Totally. Yeah, it's such an interesting subject to dig into because I think it is kind of a different experience for everyone, but everyone experiences it on some level within mountain biking. And I know through your work, you've been lucky enough to ride with a whole lot of really high level riders and athletes. I think it was Remy you mentioned once that you worked with Remy, you went and did some riding with him, and he was talking about how he experiences risk creep on his level. Can you speak on that?
Yeah, it was fascinating chatting with him and his perspectives on how he managed that risk. And he really emphasized the need for situational awareness. So athletes that operate at that level are, they're so conscious at every little change. So he talked about the sort of the factors that he uses. And a big part of that is the external factors, being aware of those external factors, weather, how these things change, and how your bike is set up. Because biking, we have that interface of bike with ground. And an athlete like him he's so excellent at knowing exactly what he needs to do with his bike to make it safe. for him to do that, or as safe as possible to complete that thing. So it could be the difference of 2 psi in your tire. Could be the difference. I'm sure racers and athletes have that same. They understand the difference between those little subtle changes in your bike, for example, and being aware of those external factors, and also being aware of the internal factors, how somebody's feeling that day, getting to the top of a feature and saying, no, I'm not feeling this today. I'm not going to ride this.
Yeah.
And that's for those athletes. I think that's something that they've talked about, is being aware of that external factors and the internal factors to really make sure you're making those decisions, managing the risk as safely as possible.
Totally. Yeah. It's so cool to hear that perspective, isn't it? 'Cause I think a lot of us can sit back and watch the videos on Instagram, watch the videos on YouTube, and it looks like some of these guys and girls are just sending it, just being absolutely really reckless, just crazy on another level. But then when you actually speak to them, you kind of hear about like the ones that aren't injured very often. They are being hyper aware of the situation and making sure they're so prepared and taking every precaution possible not to get hurt.
Yeah, I would say it's multiple hours of preparation for that 10-second Instagram clip. It's not a 10-second Instagram clip. It's the culmination of hours and hours of prep and scoping and line prep and all of that stuff.
Totally.
It's fascinating to watch them operate at that level.
And speaking of situational awareness, it reminds me of another question I did want to ask you. And I'm curious, like, what do you recommend that just an everyday mountain biker carry with them when they ride? I know there's a bit of a trend these days to be kind of like riding packless, even ditch the fanny pack these days, have everything on your bike. But it always, really, really opens my eyes every time I do another first aid course with you about how quickly things can go wrong and how much more comfortable we can keep ourselves and our buddies in the backcountry if we just carry a few first aid items on us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a tremendous freedom in moving through these spaces that are actually risky, moving through the realm of actual risk, but feeling prepared for it. In the winter, having enough stuff. I've spent an accidental night out in the bush in a snow cave in the Rockies in Colorado. And we had enough stuff that the night moved from a night that could have been fatal to one that was uncomfortable, but very survivable because we had enough equipment. So in the summer, of course, we don't have those objective hazards of snow and avalanche and all that kind of stuff. And we have generally much more favorable weather. But I think there's a few key features that we should have. I mean, number one would be some sort of first aid training, understanding that if you're riding in Squamish, you're in a wilderness environment where help might be more than an hour away. So important to mentally prep yourself for that and have at least a basic first aid course.
So what is kind of like the baseline first aid course for just your everyday mountain biker, someone that's not doing it for work, they're not guiding any other individuals, they're just out there riding for fun with their buddies?
There's a lot of different programs out there. Some of them like outdoor emergency care or occupational first aid are very focused on sort of the professional space. You can get a standard first aid course that teaches the basics. They generally have an urban focus. I think a wilderness first aid course is your best for a mountain biker. And I think the wilderness or remote first aid, as some organizations are calling it now, can be as short as a 16-hour course. I think that's the place to start. That really focuses on bleeding control, airway management, CPR, keeping somebody warm, which the literature is abundantly showing us that sometimes keeping somebody warm is one of the most important things we can do. And then having a few things that you bring with you alongside that training. So it can be a very short course just to give you the basics and a focus on decision making, understanding, is this person sick or is this person not sick? Do I need to call SAW or is this something we can extricate on our own? That's a big focus, I think. And you can learn that in a very short period of time. The basics, bleeding control, airway management, keeping somebody warm and making decisions.
Yeah, man, that's fantastic. And I know it's played a big part in my journey as a mountain biker and just like feeling confident and reducing some of the anxiety that comes with going out onto the trails and taking some risks on our bike. It gave me a huge sense of control after doing like a wilderness course versus the OEC courses that I've done before that. Actually knowing that I know what the hell to do with the first aid kit that's in my backpack. So that's a great one and so cool that, you can come along to just a weekend course. It's really quick, relatively inexpensive, and it's not that big a pack to carry, is that? So I know I've brought a small little pack for you that's kind of the essentials I take just on personal rides with me. I've got a bigger one when I'm working professionally. But what are the basics or like the must-haves you'd say when you go out for any ride?
Yeah, so it could be a very small first aid kit. So number one is having something for bleeding control. The literature shows us that if someone's got a major deadly bleed, we have to stop that bleeding right away. Doesn't happen that often mountain biking, but I have seen it that you have major arterial bleeding. So you need a bleeding control kit. That can be something as simple as a gauze pad and a tensor bandage. There's also commercial pressure dressings, various different commercial bleeding control tools, but have something to stop bleeding. That's super important as sort of step number one. The next most important thing really is something to keep somebody warm. So having 2 space blankets, a bivy sack, an extra jacket, having some way of keeping somebody warm. The literature shows us that when people get cold, things fall apart. We bleed more. Nothing works properly when we get cold. So keeping somebody warm is super important. Also having some minor splinting stuff. So things like triangular bandages, a SAM splint to allow you to do some splinting.
Totally. Yeah, really good advice there. And it's great. Like all these things are packed down really small. Even if you're dead against carrying a hip pack or some kind of backpack, like you could probably fit this stuff in your pockets. So it's fantastic just knowing that it doesn't have to be your big bulky guiding pack when you're out there shredding with your buddies. You can keep yourself safe with just a small kit that you know how to use. There's no use carrying it if you don't know how to use
Absolutely.
it.
And a lot of wilderness first aid is common sense. So you can do good bleeding control without those tools. But I think having those tools makes you feel confident. And also having something to manage an airway with, whether that's a CPR mask, that's another conversation. Please take a CPR course because that's another very time-sensitive intervention. But having an understanding of, we talk a lot in our course about ideal to real, understanding that ideal, I'd have this full pack, but the reality is we can't bring that many things. So really spending some time to figure out something for bleeding control, keeping somebody warm, managing airway, and do some splinting stuff. And that'd be my recommendations of there's also lots of nice things like blister control and all of these other kind of nice to haves. But I think the first aid kit that we've put together really focuses on those major pieces of bleeding control, airway, breathing, circulation, and keeping somebody warm.
Fantastic. Yeah, and not to sound like a plug here, but I really do believe that's a good kit. You sell them somewhere here in Squamish, right?
Yeah, so they're available at Escape Route, and they're also available on our website.
Yeah, fantastic. So if anyone's interested in keeping them and their buddies safe, yeah, check out Matt's website there, which I'll have in the show notes. So you're lucky enough to work with a whole bunch of different people from a whole bunch of different outdoor industries, and you work, within the paramedic space as well. I'm curious, is there anything you've ever learned from a student while being the teacher?
It's a good question. I learn something all the time. I'm lucky enough as an educator now to have really great students. And the students really do help shape me as an educator. I'm thankful that a lot of the students are able to, especially in my paramedic educator career, the students are very able to tell me when there's something I could have done better. But I think it's really just watching students trust their intuition. I think first aid is sometimes more complex, perhaps, and some courses make it very complex and seem scary. A lot of it's common sense. So watching students decision make and use their various skill sets, whether we work a lot with people that are coming from a high level competition background, moving into the guiding and coaching space, just watching them use their intuition to troubleshoot, problem solve, and come up with solutions and things that I've never seen or thought of before. So I think it's just understanding that everyone has a really great toolbox and providing a space for them to pull those tools out of their toolbox and use them. And not as an educator coming in with the idea of I'm going to teach you something, but more I'm a facilitator that's going to facilitate the learning experience. We're going to learn together. That's something that I think has my perspective as an educator has changed a little bit and something I'm still working on learning.
Yeah, man, that's a fantastic insight there. I like what you were saying about this idea of problem solving. And like as mountain bikers, I think you're right. Like we naturally all have this amazing kit for problem solving. I think mountain biking really is a sport of solving problems. Mm-hmm. How can I ride this line? How can I do this? How can I use my skills? Same thing with first aid, eh? How can I use what I happen to have in my pack today to help solve this problem of my friend is hurt? I like it. I like it. I wanted to dive in here, maybe a little deeper into the mental side of things. I know we had a really interesting, insightful conversation at the last first aid course I did with you. In relation to some of your past work as a paramedic, being in these high stress situations where you experienced a lot of adrenaline and almost getting to this point where like that was your baseline, but really highly strung a lot of the time, that was where you felt most comfortable. Could you speak a little bit on that?
Yeah, it's certainly a journey, one that I have definitely not figured out, but I think it is easy for many of us, whether we're first responders or athletes or whatever endeavor we use. We use stress as a coping tool. We use adrenaline as a coping mechanism. That meme, my mountain bike's cheaper than therapy. And I think that can be a bit of a misnomer. I think starting as a paramedic at a very young age, I certainly learned to live in the red. And I remember a lot of times in the various things that I was doing, I had this idea that I had to be scared. I wasn't having fun unless I was scared. Mm-hmm. So really pushing it and using, whether it was my work or my hobbies, I got really into kayaking for a couple of years. I had this idea I had to be scared to be having a good time. And I think now I've learned that it's not necessarily healthy. We look at that mental health continuum. And I think Tori Wood talked about this on her podcast, is finding that mental health continuum. If you look at green, which is, optimally relaxed, then there's yellow and orange where we're stressed, but we're still functioning well. And there's red where we're overstressed and we're completely not functional. I think the temptation is to operate in that yellow to orange all the time. And, that's sometimes called eustress. It's actually good for us. That's where athletes find their flow state when they're stressed to a certain point, but making sure we're not living in the red. And I think the temptation sometimes in these sports is to constantly be living that way. And then we can't function when we're not there. So it's been a journey for me, both personally and professionally, and my hobbies, to learn to appreciate the little things, to slow down and to not feel like I have to be scared to be having a good time.
Yeah, such a good insight there, and such an important insight, I think. It's so cool to hear that you've learned over the years to slow down and maybe appreciate the smaller things, and even if we relate it to mountain biking, appreciate the trails we ride on where we aren't about to fall off a cliff or we aren't about to go over the handlebars. I think so common, especially here in BC, where we have got some really technical trails, we've got some big jumps, we've got some really hard stuff. It can be easy to get caught up in that trap of like, I have to ride really hard stuff to have fun. Like you say, if I'm not taking risks, it's not fun. But I think, yeah, it is definitely a dangerous road to go down. And it's not necessarily a healthy place to be within the sport if we can't have fun. Just riding simple stuff. I know for me, it's kind of like, if I ride something that maybe I could ride in my sleep, it could be maybe like I could ride it in that green zone where I'm not even having to focus. Sometimes I'll try and be more playful on my bike or mix things up or try a slightly different line or something like that to bring it into that fun zone for me without turning the terrain dial way up past my skill set. Yeah, really cool to get your insight there. So when you're not working, when you're out there on the mountain bike these days, I'm curious, do you have any like key mental tools or techniques that you use to help yourself have a fun ride?
I think it's just learning to be more appreciative of where we live and the trails we get to ride on. And I do a lot of riding with my daughter now on the shotgun, and I've had some amazing rides with her. So it's just seeing the trails through her eyes and stopping to explore the little things and just seeing how awesome it is. Yeah, you can also get a certain creep, I think, where if you're chasing something, nothing's ever good enough because you're always looking for the next thing, and you've ridden this bike park and that other bike park was better, or if it's skiing, whatever it is. And I think it's part of it is just slowing down and appreciating the little things that we have and where we live and just how awesome it is. We just went for a little 20-minute ride and we rode a really fun slab trail. And I think slowing down and appreciating it is a big part of it.
Totally, man. Yeah, I love that gratitude. It's really, really hard to be unhappy when we're being grateful, right?
100%. And it's easy to feel, especially as a father now and super busy, it's easy to feel like, I'm not doing all the things I want to do, but yeah, being grateful for just where we live is amazing.
Exactly. And being grateful for what you are doing, all the great things you are doing, whether it's within your work, within your family life, or within your hobbies. So awesome, man. And that kind of reminds me of that saying, like, the little things aren't little. And I think it's the same in our mountain biking, like slowing down and noticing the subtle things, whether it's noticing the nature around us or even just like subtle changes in our technique over time, or taking a look back and being like, hey, 2 years ago, that trail was really, really hard. I could never consider myself doing it. And now we just went for a chill 20-minute ride and you rode down all of Hueso without skipping any features. Like, that's awesome.
Yeah. And that is the fun, right? And I think that's the awesome thing about mountain biking. It is progressing. It is pushing it. And I still like to do that. And I'm a big proponent. I think every human needs to do that. But doing that in a way where you're not addicted to that progression. You can do that progression, but then you can also have a chill ride with your daughter or your partner or your friend. And, you don't qualify your friends based on their skill in your chosen discipline. You have friends that are, that you just appreciate their company.
Totally. Yeah.
Because it's easy when you're chasing something to only go on a ride with people who shred or whatever it is.
It's like, variety is the spice of life. And it's the same with mountain biking, in my opinion. Yeah, I love that, man. And we were chatting there out on our ride about, talking about risk creep and potentially like risky people. How do you choose your riding buddies these days?
I think that changes, especially as a father now. My risk tolerance has changed. And as I've started working professionally, I think it's changed. I'm looking for people that I can really communicate well. I think that's part of it, where I can feel safe with them to say, hey, I don't feel like riding this today. That adage of just because you can doesn't mean you should. So I think I'm looking for people that I can be intentional with, I can communicate with, that are, I know they're going to be okay if I choose to back down, not ski that line or not ride that feature. And I think, yeah, I think that's what I'm looking for, is people that communicate well, that I can feel comfortable with. And a big part of being outside to me is community and recreating and having conversations with people, talking about things that matter.
Yeah,
So people that share that passion, not just for the sport, but also for having good conversation.
totally. Yeah. No, sounds like a really sound technique you've got there for choosing who you go out with. Because I think it is important. Like at the end of the day, we never want to be pressured into something we don't feel like doing on that day, whether we have the skills to do it or not. And we also don't want to be picking our buddies up off the trail and having to do first aid either. So really important that you're, yeah, riding with people with like a similar risk tolerance to you, and that you're okay, being out there and listening to your intuition in front of that crew. Really important. I'm curious, talking about challenges today, we rode a slab trail. It's been a bit of a goal for you. Do you ever experience like fear, doubt, hesitation, things like this on the mountain bike?
Yeah, often. I mean, I'm not that good at bikes compared to most people that I ride with. So, I've always struggled with something. I have, as a kid, I was an extremely anxious child. So I think there's a certain power in overcoming that for sure. Um, so yes, I definitely struggle with that sort of fear, and especially doing like working in the bike park, where you see how much people can get really, really injured riding bikes. I had a bad crash myself last summer, but I think for me, it's understanding, trying to be very situationally aware and understand of how I'm feeling that day and where I'm at, and then visualizing success and knowing that I can do something when I do it, but really listening to my gut and seeing how I feel that day. And I think that I've learned to trust myself, that if I feel good about something, I can do it. And if I don't feel it, I should just back off.
Totally, totally.
I don't have the skill set that some folks have where they can just send it and it sort itself out. I don't possess that skill set. So I have to be more intentional.
Oh man, I think it's wise words, man. I honestly think it's an illusion to think that anyone has that skill set. We're all, I think, experiencing the same battles, just on different levels.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why, I love doing this podcast, because no matter who I speak to, it's like we can draw parallels. It's like, okay, like, yeah, what you're talking about, I totally experienced that too. It might be on a completely different trail. But we're all on these parallels. And I think, yeah, sometimes looking at the pro riders, it's like, oh, they have the skill set, they can ride out anything. Maybe not the case. It's just like they can ride out that particular thing they're trying, because it's just out of their comfort zone. They're taking the right amount of risks. But I totally agree with what you're saying. Sometimes we will see people kind of like get away with murder on the bike. It's like, how did they possibly ride that out? So yeah, I'm curious, kind of moving into challenges on the bike. What has been one of your biggest challenges? And this can be like looking way back in the past, kind of into your racing career, or present day challenges.
It's that piece of learning to trust myself, overcoming that self-doubt, feeling confident that if I've done the work and I feel like I can do something, that I can do it. And I think that's probably, it's that component of self-doubt where you learn to trust yourself.
That's fantastic. So doing the work, so you take away that unknown, take away that anxiety, like, no, I've done the work, I deserve to be here. Yeah, I like that. And for you, like, how do you do the work if you're like, okay, I'm not quite ready for this trail, this feature? What's your process there?
I think it's multifactorial, making sure that I'm physically fit, which, as a father and very busy, I don't have the same amount of time to work on my physical fitness, but I'm doing my best I can to do some movement every day and have a workout routine I do every day. So make sure I'm physically fit, make sure I'm checking in mentally, making sure that I'm not doing things for the wrong reasons, making sure that I'm feeling good mentally that day. And then just going out, riding the feature, working up to it, watching other folks ride the feature, riding with people like yourself. I'm lucky enough now to have a lot of people that are coaches that I ride with, or I can watch them ride. And then the last piece, of course, is making sure my bike is sorted out that day. I just put a fresh tire on, and that gives you a lot of confidence when you're those little things where you make sure your bike is in good shape and you've done a good bike check and you've really dialed things in. So it's that multifaceted piece. It really comes down to situation awareness, the internal factors. How am I feeling? External factors. Do we have the weather? Is my bike set up properly? And then the human factors. Who am I with? And making sure that I align all of those things, and then feeling good about it and not having any self-doubt when I drop into a feature.
Yeah, that's fantastic, man. Ticking all the boxes, and I love it. You just listed like the 4 things I always work on with mountain bikers in my coaching courses. It's like the technical skills, that's a big one. We've got the physical fitness, you talked about, our strength as well. We've got our mental side of things, and then we've also got like the tactical and the equipment there that day. So really well-rounded approach. I love it. So do you have any mottos or anything you say to yourself to keep yourself grounded while you're out there for a ride?
Yeah, I mean, there is the saying, slow is smooth and smooth is fast, which is something that I think is largely true. But again, I've been processing this recently, both in my professional work as a paramedic and in my sporting life as a amateur skier, mountain biker. Um, I think there is a level of truth in that. But I think what I'm focusing on now is trying to be smooth and understanding sometimes that can be moving fast. Sometimes moving fast is very smooth, but focusing on being smooth and understanding whether I'm setting up to do a sort of high risk procedure like endotracheal intubation in a patient or riding a feature, sometimes speed is your friend. So it's not just focusing on being slow, because sometimes slow is janky and you need to get things done quickly.
Mm.
And I think it was Paul Howard that was talking about that. And we were chatting about Paul's comments about that, where it's, so you need to be focused on being smooth. So I think that's what I'm focusing on now, is being smooth, understanding sometimes that means moving quickly, but making sure you're moving quickly intentionally. For example, going into a feature, creeping into a slab slow, and then exiting it quickly, carrying speed through, rather than hucking into it, going fast and having to get on the brakes and getting yourself in trouble. So focusing on being smooth, I think, would be the mantra of what I'm striving for now, both as a professional and as a rider.
Yeah, it's such an interesting comparison, isn't it, there? Because when we look at it in the medical world or the first aid world, if we rush into something, we can potentially make like a very bad mistake. We can get someone's wound infected. We can make something worse. Whereas if we go in a little slower, a little smoother, we can potentially finish the job fast, finish the task fast. And same thing with our riding, isn't it? If we go in smooth, we think about it, we look at the line first, chances are we might be a little faster as a result. Whereas if we rush into it really fast, we might end up mid-feature or mid-corner and have to wipe out all our speed, and it's going to be really sloppy, really janky, like you said.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, interesting stuff to keep in mind, both for our riding and for our work there. And I know winding the clock back to even your days out in Ontario, you've got a bit of a racing background. You've done some pretty cool races. And it's really cool because I know our last guest on the show, Nick Van Egmond from Bicycle Broker, is one of your buddies from out in Ontario. You guys did some racing together back in the day. So on that note, I wanted to ask you, how did your mindset differ for competition versus riding for fun?
Well, I raced in the cross country world way back in the early 2000s. So I think that was all about suffering. It was all about suffering more than the person next to you and not letting them know that you were suffering. It was about trying to get the whole shot, beat them up the climb, and then get into the single track where you could sort of control the pace. I was never terribly good or terribly fast, but I did enjoy it. Spent quite a few years doing that. So I think at that point it was about the suffering. It was about trying to be smooth and be flowy and all that stuff, but it was really about the suffering. I think that's where my head was at that time in my life anyways.
Totally. And I think that's common throughout the sport. It's amazing just like looking back and seeing how the culture's changed to today, where, for sure there's still some people out there that probably love suffering and do races for that reason. But I think it's shifted largely towards like having fun, ride for fun
Totally.
versus like ride to beat yourself up.
I really got out of riding for a bunch of years. I really got into paddling and that. And I just, kind of the late around 2008, 2010, I kind of got out of riding completely. And it was really enduro riding that brought me back in, because like, this is what I did as a kid, right? You're pushing your bike up something to go down with your buddies and go try to go fast on the down.
Totally.
I was like, this is awesome. This is just fun. So I think it's that enduro mentality that, for me anyways, really made me realize how much I love mountain biking.
Totally, man. Totally. It's so much fun. And we were talking there, on our ride about a race you did. I think it was the Trans BC. It's a multi-day, multi-stage endurance race. And you were talking about a bit of a tactic you had, and you ended up doing all right with that tactic. If you mind sharing that one.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who isn't particularly talented as a rider, my goal was just to be smooth and to stay on my bike. And I found myself, I raced it once in 2017, and I've been involved with it every year since on the medical team. And honestly, it's more fun to be on the medical team and not have to try and go fast. But I found the goal of in a long race like that, it's different than a DH race, which is, one run, go fast. A race like that, those 7-day stage races are all about surviving with your bike and body intact. So I found myself just riding to stay on my bike, being smooth, and that did serve me well. Again, some people are just fast. Those people win races, but I had a lot of fun. I stayed on my bike and I found myself doing better than I thought I would, just keeping my bike and body intact.
Totally, man. I think that's a great bit of advice. And I know these days we're lucky that the sport is going to boom in. A whole lot of people are getting into mountain biking for the first time. And a whole lot of people are starting to try out some enduro races, some downhill races for the first time. We're going to see record numbers of signups, which is rad. If you could give someone one bit of advice for getting into enduro racing, what would it be?
With the hat I wear now, we do a lot of medical risk management for a lot of enduro races, whether it's EWS or the Canadian Enduro League, Squamish Enduro. And we're seeing so many people coming into riding, and I think it's awesome. There's less barriers to entry, and we're seeing lots of people getting into riding and racing, which is amazing. But we're also seeing people that don't have as much experience potentially as we had in the past. And it's also, the bikes are so good right now. You know, when I started riding, it was a hardtail with 26-inch wheels and 1.5 inches was a fat tire. And my first fork was a Jet XC with 2 inches of elastomer travel. So when you were going fast, it was very scary. You knew you were going fast. Now bikes are so good that you can be well in the realm of actual risk and not really feel scared because the bike is so capable. So I think my advice for somebody getting into enduro racing would be to focus on being smooth and do the work and really just try and figure out your bike, try and figure out yourself, work on all of those aspects of fitness and understanding your bike, understanding yourself. And also just realizing that the spaces you're moving in, even in a race context, are quite remote where extrication can be difficult. So just to sum it all up, I'd say understand the risks that you're taking.
Totally. Yeah, it's really cool getting your perspective too, because I think often we'll be like, oh, I'm at a race, there's a medical tent, like see these guys in red walking around, like I'm good, I can take all these risks. And same thing at the bike park. But in reality, like you say, it can still be hours before we get to actual help, and we could be in a lot of pain in a really uncomfortable, dangerous situation for a long time if we do move too far above our comfort level and we are taking actual risk there and potentially suffering the consequences. So,
And that progression is essential. And that feeling of flow you get in a race mode where you find that extra 10% of speed is amazing. And I think it's really good to do that. But yeah, just be aware, I think, of the risks that you're taking and be aware of the consequences. Even with a really dialed medical team, like you mentioned, it can still be a long, difficult evacuation. We're super lucky to have really awesome search and rescue teams up and down the Sea to Sky. They're all volunteers and they're super busy. So just being aware of those risks that we're taking when we're moving through these spaces.
totally, man. Yeah. And I love how you're not just like some dad who's like, don't take risks, risks are risky. You're like, hey, go shred your mountain bike, go race, push yourself because that's fun. That's why we do it. But also be aware, like these are some of the risks we're taking when we're doing that.
Absolutely. And we all know folks who've had significant injuries from biking or skiing. I've had 2 friends pass away in the mountains in ski accidents, and know people have been badly injured. I had a bad crash myself last summer. So that's the sport that we play, but just being aware of those risks and checking in with yourself and making sure that you're okay with taking those risks. And that you've done your best to prepare yourself, your bike, mentally, physically for those risks.
Totally. And for you, like, how do you manage confidence in a competitive environment? I know, often this word gets thrown around like race nerves and whether that affects you positively, it brings you up or it brings you down. Like, how would you manage that?
Well, I was never terribly successful at that. Honestly, if I was, I probably would have been a better racer.
You're a modest guy.
I think I find in my professional world, again, dealing with that sort of mental aspect, whether it's a high stress bike race or a high stress patient care situation, I think it's that piece of trying to be smooth. And a big part of that is breath. I certainly do that at work when I'm in a stressful situation. And again, I've been doing this for a long time as a professional first responder, and I still struggle with that. But it's those pieces of slowing down, taking 4 big breaths, working on your breath, dropping your heart rate, and then moving in to complete the task.
Yeah.
So in a race context, it would happen to me all the time. You get offline, you're trying to go fast. So you're going fast, you're in the rhubarb banging off rocks. And now you're trying to go faster. So you get more in the rhubarb. Sometimes you just have to slow down. So managing that by using your breath, slow down, focus, check in with yourself, tell yourself, I have the skills to do this. Now let's do it smoothly.
Yeah, fantastic. So taking your mind back to the task at hand and using breath as like almost like an anchor to bring yourself back to the present. It's so easy when we're racing, isn't it, to like mess up one corner and almost like carry that corner in our mind for the next 3 and then let that, one mistake kind of compound into 4 corners you've now messed up because you're thinking about the one that's, 200 meters back up the trail.
And avoiding negative self-talk. It's really easy to beat ourselves up. I don't know, Tori talked about that as well. And that's something that I was not that good at, to be honest, was I would really beat myself up for making mistakes. And I think that translates into personal lives as well. We have a tendency to do that. We beat ourselves up for mistakes. Having
Totally.
grace for yourself, like, I'm doing the best I can, not to be smooth.
Exactly. And yeah, making mistakes is okay. That's what being human is, for sure. What does your self-talk look like when you're racing? Like, say you've blown out one corner, you're like, that didn't go the way I intended it to. That didn't go the way it did in practice. What are you telling yourself?
Tell myself to be smooth
Hmm.
and have fun.
Yeah.
I'm at a space in life where I don't have a lot of time off to just go do fun things. So it's changed my perspective when I do get the chance to just ride for fun, which doesn't happen all that often.
Yeah.
To just say, this is fun.
Yeah.
Like, I'm choosing to be here and this is awesome.
Yeah.
So
That's
just focusing
fantastic.
on being smooth and having fun, I think it helps shift your perspective. Yeah.
Totally. And that's a good one for racing as well. It can be, really easy to get caught up in the whole, it's race day, I have to go at 100%, that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, like, you've probably signed up to the race because racing is fun for you.
Totally.
So try to have fun on race day and you'll probably end up being faster as a result. That's fantastic. Now, you're probably going to laugh at this next question a little bit. I do want to ask it because the bike park is opening this Friday, and it's a really common kind of saying that gets thrown around in the mountain biking world. I think it's a bit of an old school one. But what's your take on this idea that, like, if you're not crashing, you're not learning?
Yeah, I think crashing sucks. I mean, what I do professionally, I deal with people after they've crashed, and there's significant injuries. There's been a couple significant injuries already this year in the Sea to Sky. I think you do need to progress, but I would say crashing sucks. So try to progress in a way where you can progress without crashing.
Yeah.
Especially as you're progressing to some of these higher features, and understand if you are progressing and you are going to be taking those risks, make sure you manage those as best as possible. Wear the protective gear and do it in a place where the bike park is a great place to try and protect, brain fart.
Oh, all good.
The bike park is a great place to try and progress. But understand, when you're riding a trail like airplane mode, for example, it might feel like a bike park trail because the jumps are so great, but it's not a bike park trail. It's called airplane mode because there's no cell service there. So the response that you'll get if you're injured is very different. So pick your places to try and progress, understanding the risks involved.
Really, yeah. And it's really good stuff to know about, even just like, look up what the cell reception's like in your area. I know you can get maps online these days. That's quite easy, but it's stuff that, like, a lot of mountain bikers don't even think about until they actually grab out their phone to call you the ambulance when buddy's gone down. So yeah, really, really wise advice there. And kind of stemming off that, I know a lot of people will kind of give out this advice to mountain bikers starting out, like, oh yeah, learn how to crash. You got to learn how to crash for when it happens in mountain biking. What's your take on that?
I think it is a good skill set. I mean, for my daughter, we're getting her to gymnastics because just having that air awareness, being able to move, and in any sport you're doing, to know how to fall, it is important. And again, watching the joyride athletes is very impressive to watch their ability to crash. So if you're going to be progressing and pushing to that level, you have to learn how to crash. Watching them with the air awareness to be halfway through rotation, get into trouble, throw the bike away, tuck and roll, land, and walk away is really amazing.
It's nuts, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just unbelievable, that the situations that they can get themselves out of because of that practice.
Super impressive.
And it is a really interesting one, like thinking about maybe a beginner starting out in mountain biking, even an intermediate rider. How do you practice learning how to crash? If that's a skill, how do we practice it?
I think practicing things like a trampoline, that's a great thing about having kids. We got a trampoline, and I still practice crashing on the trampoline. So just learning how to tuck and roll, I think, is super important.
Yeah.
I think biking is a difficult one to practice crashing, but if you really want to progress, things like go to a bike park that has a foam pit and learn how to crash into the foam pit. So try and figure out how to crash in a way that's safe, whether it's learning how to tuck and roll on a trampoline or in a foam pit, something like that.
Yeah, it's a really good one. And I'm curious for your take on this. It's something I've had a lot of conversations with my riding buddies of, like, what's better when you're starting out? Is it like learning how not to crash? So learning good positioning, good braking techniques, good trail scanning, all of these things. Because I know for me, when I finally got off the couch and got some lessons, my crashing was reduced by like 90%. So I'm very much of that stance. Like, when we're starting out, we're in that kind of beginner intermediate phase the first couple of years. It's like, go and get some lessons, learn how not to crash. But then maybe if we're moving into the advanced expert stage of mountain biking, we're taking some bigger risks, we're getting some more air time, the risk of crashing goes up. maybe then that's a good time to go and jump on a trampoline, jump into an airbag, learn how to crash. What's your thoughts on that?
I totally agree with that. I think, yeah, crashing, especially on a bike, is really, it's bad.
Yeah.
So yeah, take some lessons. I'm a big believer in that. Again, we have so much great education, whether it's in the first aid space or in the bike coaching space.
Mm,
There's never been more good quality education available to folks. So get some training and try not to crash, but understanding, yeah, if you are going to be pushing it and progressing, that might happen. So learn how to take those risks.
totally. Yeah, yeah. That's fantastic, man. Really cool to hear your perspective on that as well. Because like I say, it's like I've been pondering for a while now. And just on the subject of crashes and injuries, I know a lot of the conversations and a lot of the questions I've had for you in the first aid courses I've taken with you are around concussions and how do we manage that? So I wanted you just to start by maybe defining concussion. What is a concussion?
So there's been a lot of research done around concussions, some great resources out there for various sports. Things like parachute.ca are a great resource to sort of talk about concussion management. But the literature on concussions is very, very strong right now. If you hit your head and you have any symptoms, a little bit of dizziness, a little bit of headache, the literature is showing us you have a concussion. Concussion is a bruised brain. Super important, 24 to 48 hours. Shut things down. Don't hit your head again. No screens, dark room. Sleep is good. Don't have to wake people up. That was the old school thought you have to wake them up every couple hours. No need to wake somebody up, but some of you should be with a responsible adult who can check on that person with 24 to 48 hours of full rest. It's a bruise, just like when you get pedal bang on your shin. So super important. You don't bruise your brain. You give it 24 to 48 hours to heal with no stimulation and no head hits. And then for up to 2 weeks, the literature shows us if you bang your head again in 2 weeks, it's going to be significant. And your chances of getting things like concussion-related encephalopathy and really bad sequelae is significant. So for 2 weeks, slowly resume activity, no head bonks, even bang your head on the counter can cause a significant second concussion. Resuming activity to the point where you feel symptoms and backing off when you feel it. So getting on a stationary bike, as soon as you feel a slight headache, back off. That's the literature is telling us to manage a concussion. And super important, we don't try to push through. That old school mentality of suck it up and push on is completely false when it comes to concussions.
Yeah, thanks for diving in there and kind of enlightening us because I know a lot of that was new information to me. Like you say, there's kind of this old school mentality of, just a bit of a bump on the head. But what really kind of stuck out to me, the definition of concussion was like any one symptom. Because quite often we'll blow off like, it was just a little knock to the head. I've just got a headache. It's all good. Or, just a bit dizzy. It's all good. But it's not all good. It's like, no, go home, rest up. And I think a big one there that's maybe one of the hardest things for people these days is no screens. So really important to highlight that fact. And I will put some links to some of the resources you mentioned there down in the show notes as well. I think it is a topic within our sport that is really important to start educating our listeners a little bit more on, some of the tools and some of the ways we can manage what can be potentially like a really, really challenging, really dark time for people experiencing concussion.
Absolutely, especially when you find your mental health in these sports, as we've been talking about. When you can't do those things outside, the tendency is want to get back to them as quickly as possible. Sometimes that's the worst thing. So take that time to explore other avenues, art, whatever it might be, things you typically don't have time for because you're too busy doing your active sports. I know I've had 1 or 2 concussions myself, and it's the hardest thing to slow down, but sometimes you can find some beauty in that.
For sure, yeah. That was another really good thing that Tori would mention on the podcast. Was
I
like
love her perspective on that.
having, other hobbies other than biking, so that if we potentially have an injury and we can't bike, we don't lose our whole sense of self. This whole like, I'm Jake and I'm a mountain biker, and all of a sudden it's like, holy crap, who am I? I can't ride my mountain bike anymore. Especially if it's, potentially a longer term injury and we're not sure if we are going to be able to get back on the bike and when. So, yeah, wise advice, Matt. And kind of head injuries aside, if you have a bit of a crash, you're still able to ride for the rest of the day, but it's definitely like, oh man, that sucked. What do you tell yourself directly after a crash?
I think it's slow down and be smooth. And I know when I'm in a guiding role or a tail guiding role, if someone's had a crash, we don't continue on the lesson or the day as normally would. Typically a tail guide in the ski world will take somebody back, we'll go ski a mellow slope. So really going at 50%. Because you're just not on your game. And I've seen that doing a race medical. A racer will have a crash on one stage, have a minor little finger tweak or something, and they often end up with another crash later on. So it's that piece of situational awareness and being situationally aware, not just for yourself, but for your guests. And if you're moving into a professional role, to being aware of that, saying, hey, let's dial it back. We can still have fun. We can go ski a 30-degree slope and have a great time. We can ride a blue flow trail and have an awesome time. We don't need to be pushing it. And that time is not to push it after.
Totally. And it all goes back to that decision making, doesn't it? It's like, okay, that's a decision point whenever there's a crash. And the decision is, yeah, are we going to dial it down and keep riding, or are we going to walk our bikes out? Are we good to ride our bikes out? So it takes practice, but I think like the best thing you said in there was like slow down, take a breath, think about it before you just get back on the bike and realize that your handlebars are all twisted and you're into the next slap line or something like that. Yeah, I know for myself, I had a bit of an eye opener recently. I was kind of telling you out on the ride, I've been stepping outside of my comfort zone a little bit lately, wanting to push myself in my riding. But I did have a bit of a scary, crash yesterday where it could have went really, really wrong. And it was definitely a bit of an eye opener for me. It was like, wow, you got out of that with just a grazed elbow here, but it's definitely time to dial it back, ride at 90%, maybe go back and practice some of the skills before I go back and try and hit that same line again or jump into it like I was trying to do yesterday. So good stuff to think about. And I know something really common that a lot of mountain bikers talk about, that a lot of mountain bikers experience, is this idea of like having a mental block. Maybe we've had a crash or a bit of a bad experience on a particular trail, particular feature, or even just like particular type of terrain, maybe like a rock slab or some woodwork if you're down on the shore. Do you have any tips that you'll use to minimize mental blocks in your own riding?
I think it's a piece that probably most folks use, is that piece of visualization. So being able to be confident, to start small and work your way up, and then visualize success. Realize like I've done the work, my bike is dialed in, I feel good today, conditions are great, and just visualize doing it successfully. And that's something I take into my professional space as well when I'm setting up for a high risk procedure like an intubation, for example. I just visualize success. This is going to be successful. I know I've prepared. Again, I'm a systems-based person. In my professional work, we use a checklist a lot. I run the checklist. This is what we're doing. Visualize success, slow down, breathe, and execute.
Fantastic.
And it's a little bit of that flow state. I think you spend a lot of time talking about that flow state. Very elusive, but you can find that when you kind of align everything. And I've been able to find that sometimes in riding, but even in professional context where things work properly because you've aligned everything moving up to that high risk procedure.
Totally, man. And yeah, like you said, the flow state is incredibly elusive, but it's also incredible when we do get there.
Yes.
And I couldn't agree more. It's all about, I think, taking our motivation off the outcome of riding fast or getting into the flow state or doing the big jump, winning the race, whatever that is. And like you say, thinking about how can I position myself to point towards that goal without focusing on it. Okay, so maybe I'm going to slow down. I'm going to focus on my breathing. I'm going to look a little further ahead, and I'm going to have really good body position through this line, for example. It's only for me that when I'm focusing on those things, I'm repeating them over and over in my head, that all of a sudden, occasionally I'll experience this beautiful quiet endpoint there. And it sounds like, yeah, your work's also a great tool for, helping yourself get into that state of flow where you're just doing what you're performing at a high level.
And it's challenging, and understanding there's some days you just can't find that, and having grace for yourself when you can, right? Sometimes calls just don't go well, and that's just how it is. Sometimes a ride doesn't go well. Understanding, okay, that happened. Let's just try and do better next time. And
totally.
moving on.
Yeah, I think it's probably almost impossible to get there if we have the expectation. And it's the same thing on the other end of the scale, like trying to calm ourselves down or like, alleviate some anxiety we may be experiencing out on the trail. If it's like, I need to breathe because I need to slow my heart rate, I need to calm down. What happens? Because the other way, right?
Sure.
It's like, we've got this feeling of being out of control. We need to take control to get more out of control.
Absolutely.
Whereas, something I've been really trying to play with lately is kind of telling myself like, right, I'm feeling, a little bit too alert here. I'm feeling my anxiety starting to go up. I'm a little bit anxious about this thing that I'm about to ride. I'm going to try and do some breathing. I'm going to try and do some visualization techniques. I'm going to try and use some affirmations. We'll see if I can calm myself down and ride this. But if I don't, that's all good. I can always come back tomorrow.
Exactly.
It's like you take your, take your focus off the outcome, and all of a sudden, what are you doing? You're pointing towards that.
Yeah.
So interesting, man. I could talk about this all day, but I'll let you do the talking. So that's what we're here for. Another question I wanted to ask you is like, what's your take on setting goals? How do you go about setting goals for yourself, say, in your mountain biking?
I think it's essential. And I think it's essential, especially as we're aging and moving on, to have something to strive for. I think that's the human experience, is about having those goals, but having those goals being, but not being super attached to the outcome, and having those goals be achievable. If we set unachievable goals. I think the tendency now is that we want to do this thing. We see this thing on Instagram or whatever. We want to do this thing. Set something that's incremental goals and slowly work towards it. So for example, I had the project of riding Way So Clean, and we did that today, which was
Totally.
cool. So set a goal that is doable for yourself, and also that includes other things like community. I've seen a lot of folks that really got into sport, and I kind of lost them as friends because they progressed past the level I was able to operate as, and they were chasing that sport, which is fine. And for them, that was what they need to do, and they're happy, and that's awesome. And I don't begrudge that at all. But for me, it's setting goals that allow me to progress, allow me to continue being engaged, that are incremental, that are achievable, but that also bring in the piece of community where I can still do that with people that I care about.
Yeah, I really like that. It's kind of like you're zooming out and taking like a well-rounded look at your goals. And it's like, okay, like, yeah, I want to get better at mountain biking. I want to ride these double black slabs, but I also want to experience community within your sport as well. Yeah.
And as a with a parent now, with kids and partner, it's like, can I do these things with my partner, with my kids, for example, or is it going to separate me from them?
Yeah, totally. And I agree with that as well. Like, I think, like we were saying earlier, it's really important to almost like have lots of different riding buddies at lots of different levels. And that's the spice of it, getting to ride lots of different trails with lots of different people. Certainly, yeah, how I like to ride. I've got a couple more questions here before we start wrapping things up. A couple of deep ones for you. And here's one you might have to think about a little bit. Is there anyone that you look up to in the mountain biking world in particular?
I think growing up, it was, like most people that get in the bike world, it was people doing cool stuff. I remember I was briefly into trials riding, and Hans Ray was the kind of person you look up to, or XC racers, the heyday of XC racing guys like Ryder, Hesjedal, and those guys. But I think it's probably folks that have taken their bike careers, turned them into successful business people that also really have strong families and are been able to do things like that. So I think if people in the Sea to Sky, people like Paul Howard or Darren Butler that have really built successful businesses that have not lost touch with community, that have community focused businesses, they're successful business people, they have successful relationships, both personal and professional people around them. So I think that's probably who I would look up to now in the biking world, is people who've taken their sport and built it into businesses with successful human interactions as well.
Totally. Yeah, that's a really cool answer. And kind of, going back to your goals, people that have experienced a lot of success within the mountain biking world, within business, that haven't kind of lost touch of the community aspect and what's really important. And another question I wanted to ask you here, what does a perfect ride look like for you these days, and why?
I think it really depends, but it's a ride where I feel smooth, feel that everything clicks. I've had some amazing rides. My daughter's old enough now that, I've had some amazing rides. We ride half Nelson with her on the shotgun. She's 3 now. And I've had some amazing rides where it's just super smooth and she's stoked. I think it's just a ride where everybody's stoked with good vibes. And sometimes that's pushing it. Sometimes that's, I've been exploring a lot in the Chilcotin, and sometimes that's doing big kind of mega epic days where you're with buddies and it's like a gnarly day, but you find that flow. Sometimes it's riding roller coasters with my daughter. Sometimes it's days where you're progressing. So it really, for me, it's about finding the stoke and finding the flow and having good conversations. That's a big part of it for me, is community, being around people where I can be in intentional community with the people I'm with, and then outside and moving.
Totally, man. Yeah, so many aspects there. Self-exploration, community, having good conversations. Got to say, I agree, man. So these are some of my favorite rides to do, because we get stoked. We start talking about bikes. We talk about mindset, talk about learning, and then we go on shred. We've kind of talked about all sorts of different things during this conversation. I wanted to give you the opportunity here. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about or wanted to bring up as we start to wind down here?
I think it's just that aspect of bringing back that aspect of mental health, checking with yourself as to why you're riding and why I have to do that. Am I riding to escape, or am I riding because I'm stoked? And also understanding how these sports can affect us. And I've really seen folks struggle both when they've been injured and also when their friends have been injured. When, if you're part of an incident where somebody's badly injured, expect that it's going to affect you psychologically. And that's okay. That's part of being human. So I've seen that affect people when they've been involved in an incident, and the sport they love is the thing that has caused that injury, that trauma. And again, I know Tori has spoken about this as well. So just being able to check in with yourself, check in with your mental health, especially if you've been involved in something.
Totally. Yeah. Thanks for talking on that. I think it's a really important conversation to have, to just spread awareness and almost, yeah, take away from this kind of old school macho culture of like, we don't need to talk about emotions. Like, so what? You've seen something gnarly, who cares? But it's like, no, this stuff is actually traumatic and you should take the time to process that properly. For someone that is struggling with mental health, what do you recommend, whether they've, had a bad crash, a setback, experienced something stressful on the trails?
Lots of great resources out there. I would just seek out a mental health professional there. And there's folks that are doing incredible work that are coming from an athletic background that are now getting trained as clinical counselors, psychologists, et cetera. So I would say reach out in the community and reach out to somebody who has that background, and don't hesitate to have those conversations. And again, coming back, that piece of situational awareness, being aware of your situation, being aware that, yeah, this has affected me and I need to actually talk to somebody about this.
Totally. Yeah. And we kind of talked about that on our ride again, didn't we? Like, it's so common to go to a physio and do maintenance checkups to make sure your body's moving well. We go to the gym and make sure we're physically fit. But quite often we don't go and seek mental health help until it's like a crisis, until we're, breaking down, really needing it. So I think it's really cool these days that we're starting to normalize, like it is normal to go and see a counselor, to go and see a psychologist, to go and talk about your emotions, process these things.
Absolutely. That's a challenge. I mean, it's always a journey, and it's easy to lose situational awareness as to where you're at on that journey as well, I think.
Totally.
But yeah, checking in with yourself is super important.
I love it, man. What's the biggest takeaway you hope listeners will learn from this conversation?
I think taking a risk is super important. I think it's a huge part of the human experience. So take risks. It's great to take risks. It's good for us, but be situationally aware, check in with yourself mentally, physically. Try not to let your sport separate you from community. And focus on the things that make you truly happy. And if that's pushing it, then go push it. If that's community, then focus on community. But really check in with yourself and use that situational awareness piece. And this is a journey I'm still on. I certainly don't have it figured out.
Totally, man. I think just like mountain biking in life, we never stop learning, and that's what makes it fun.
Totally. We had the conversation today. There's always something that on a mountain bike that is going to humble you, no matter who you are, how good you are. There's always something that you can push through, and there's always something that's going to humble you. And I think that's the beauty of the sport.
Yeah, especially living here when we've got double black trails in our backyard.
Absolutely.
For sure, man. So where can people find you online and follow your adventures?
Sure. So you can follow us. Our business page is at Canadian Outdoor Med, and my personal page is at Wilderness Flight Medic. So feel free to jump on there.
Fantastic. And your website there, if anyone's wanting to purchase a first aid kit, is that just your business name?
Yes, and that'll be www.canadianoutdoormed.com.
Fantastic, man. Look, thank you so much for taking the time to come for a ride with me, to sit down and answer all of my questions. I've had an absolute blast.
Thanks, buddy.
Thank you so much. I was about to give you my trademark awkward high five there again, but we'll avoid that one today. But I've had an absolute blast. Thank you so much. And can't wait to get out on the trails again soon.
Thanks for having me. Let's go for a ride soon.
Right on, dude. Let's do it. What's up, guys? Just one more thing before you hit the trails. If you enjoyed this podcast, please be sure to subscribe and don't be a stranger. I'd love to hear from you about any topics or any particular episodes that you enjoyed, and even about any guests that you'd like to hear me have on the show in the future. You can find me on Instagram at _mind_mountain. This podcast, mountain biking, and mindset are all things that are very close to my heart. So I feel super grateful to be able to share these conversations with you. So much love to you all for taking the time to listen. I'll see you next time.